used to think the worst thing you could encounter while camping was a bear. I was wrong. My brother-in-law died protecting me from something that shouldn't exist. My name's Mike, and what I'm about to tell you happened 3 summers ago in northern Michigan. I still wake up in cold sweats thinking about it. Most people wouldn't believe this story, but I've got the scars on my arms and the guilt in my chest to prove every word is true. Every July for the past 12 years, my brother-in-law and I would take a week-long camping trip somewhere remote. We called it our reset week, time to get away from demanding jobs, nagging wives, and the constant buzz of city life. He worked construction, I managed a small auto parts store. Both of us dealt with people problems all day long, so these trips were our chance to decompress and remember what really mattered. My brother-in-law was the outdoorsman between us. Growing up on a farm in rural Michigan, he'd learned hunting and fishing from his grandfather. He taught me everything I knew about camping, how to tie proper knots, read weather patterns, set up camp without damaging the environment, and most importantly, how to respect the wilderness. The guy could start a fire in a downpour and catch fish with nothing but a safety pin and some thread. We'd been to Sleeping Bear Dunes, the Porcupine Mountains, Isle Royale, and dozens of state parks across the Great Lakes region. But by our 11th trip, we'd exhausted most of the easily accessible spots. We wanted something different, something completely off the beaten path. That's when he found the location through an old hunting forum. Some guy had posted coordinates for a remote lake deep in the Ottawa National Forest, about 40 miles northwest of Iron Mountain. The post was buried in a thread about forgotten fishing holes and had only gotten 3 replies. The original poster claimed the lake was surrounded by old-growth forest and hadn't seen human visitors in decades. He'd stumbled across it while bow hunting in the early 2000s and sworn it was the most pristine wilderness he'd ever seen. The drive alone would be an adventure. 3 hours from the nearest gas station, with the last hour on unmarked dirt roads that might not even exist anymore. Perfect for what we wanted: total isolation. We left on a Friday morning in July, trucks loaded with enough supplies for 5 days. The first 2 hours were easy, highway driving through small Michigan towns. We stopped for lunch in Iron Mountain, gassed up both vehicles, and bought extra ice for the coolers. The locals at the gas station had never heard of the area we were headed to, which only made us more excited. The dirt road started about 20 miles out of town. At first, they were well-maintained county roads, wide enough for 2 vehicles. But as we got deeper into the forest, they narrowed to single-lane tracks, barely visible through overgrown brush. Twice we had to stop and clear fallen branches blocking the path. My brother-in-law led the way in his pickup, and I followed in mine, trying to stay close enough that I wouldn't lose sight of his taillights through the dust. The last 10 miles took us almost an hour. We were crawling along at maybe 5 miles per hour, trucks rocking over ruts and stones, branches scraping against both sides. I started wondering if we'd made a mistake. What if we got stuck out here? Cell phone coverage had disappeared an hour ago, but my brother-in-law was determined, and honestly, the adventure of it kept me going too. When we finally broke through the tree line into the clearing, both of us just sat in our trucks for a minute, staring. The lake stretched out in front of us, maybe half a mile across, perfectly still and reflecting the late afternoon sky. Dense forest surrounded it on all sides, except for this one small clearing on the south shore. Not a single sign of human presence, no fire rings, no trash, no marked trails. Just wilderness, exactly like it had been for centuries. We spent the next 2 hours setting up what turned out to be the perfect campsite. The clearing was just big enough for both tents, with plenty of room for a fire ring in between. My brother-in-law chose a spot near a cluster of birch trees where we could string our bear rope. I set up closer to the water, maybe 30 feet from the lake shore. The bear rope was always his responsibility. He'd learned the technique from his grandfather: string a rope between two trees about 12 feet off the ground. Hang the food bag in the middle where no bear could reach it. We'd used this method on every camping trip and never had a problem. He took pride in getting it exactly right, always testing the rope with his full weight before trusting it with our food. By the time we finished setting up, the sun was hanging low over the trees across the lake. We cracked open a couple of beers and just stood there taking in the view. The water was crystal clear. You could see 20 feet down near the shore. A few fish jumped occasionally, sending ripples across the otherwise perfect mirror surface. My brother-in-law fired up his camp stove and started preparing dinner while I got the fire going. We'd brought steaks for the first night, along with potatoes wrapped in foil and some canned green beans. Nothing fancy, but after 5 hours of driving through rough terrain, anything would have tasted like a feast. The first night was absolutely perfect. We stayed up until after midnight, feeding the fire and listening to the sounds of the forest. Loons called from across the lake. An owl hooted from somewhere in the darkness. Occasionally we'd hear a twig snap or leaves rustle, but nothing unusual. Just the normal sounds of a living forest at night. I fell asleep to the sound of gentle waves lapping against the shore, thinking this might be our best camping trip yet. Saturday morning, I woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. My brother-in-law was always an early riser, and he'd already gotten the camp stove going by the time I crawled out of my tent. The lake was perfectly calm, with a light mist hanging just above the surface. We spent the morning fishing from the shore and caught more bass than we knew what to do with. The fish were practically jumping onto our hooks. Within 3 hours, we'd caught 8 bass, including a couple that had to be at least 4 pounds each. Around noon, we took a break for lunch, grilled a couple of the fish we'd caught, opened some chips and sodas, and lounged in our camp chairs talking about how we'd definitely be coming back to this spot every year. That's when my brother-in-law first noticed something was wrong. He stopped chewing and cocked his head to listen. I stopped too and listened. He was right. The forest had gone completely quiet. No birds chirping, no squirrels chattering, no insects buzzing. Even the wind had died down. It was the kind of absolute silence that makes your ears ring. We tried to convince ourselves it probably just meant there was a predator nearby, maybe a bear or coyotes. But he looked troubled. He'd spent more time in the wilderness than anyone I knew, and he'd never experienced silence this complete. We continued fishing that afternoon, but the unnatural quiet persisted. Worse, we both started getting the distinct feeling we were being watched. You know that prickly sensation on the back of your neck when someone's staring at you? It was like that, but constant. We'd turn around expecting to see something at the tree line, but there was never anything there. The fish had stopped biting too. The lake that had been so productive in the morning was now completely dead. We tried different spots along the shore, different lures, even switched to live bait we dug up near the water's edge. Nothing. It was like every fish in the lake had suddenly vanished. By late afternoon, we gave up on fishing and returned to camp to start preparing dinner. The silence was starting to get to both of us, though neither wanted to admit it. We kept the conversation going, talking louder than necessary, as if our voices could push back against the oppressive quiet of the forest. That's when we heard the first howl. It came from across the lake, somewhere in the dense trees on the north shore. At first it sounded almost like a wolf howl, deep and mournful, echoing across the water. But there was something wrong with it, something that didn't fit any animal either of us knew. Too deep, too long, and there was something almost human about the way it ended. We listened as the howl repeated 2 more times, then cut off abruptly. The silence that followed felt even more oppressive than before. Both of us stared across the lake, searching the tree line for any sign of movement. Nothing. My brother-in-law suggested we move our chairs closer to the fire. It was still an hour before sunset, but something in his tone made me agree immediately. We dragged our camp chairs into a tight circle around the fire ring and built up the flames higher than necessary for cooking. We grilled the fish we'd caught that morning and tried to keep the mood light, but conversation felt forced. Every few minutes, one of us would glance toward the forest, particularly the north shore where the howls had come from. The feeling of being watched had intensified. As full darkness fell, we kept the fire burning bright and moved our conversation to quieter topics. We turned in earlier than usual, around 10 o'clock, but neither of us slept well. I kept waking up to strange noises, twigs snapping in the forest around our camp, rustling sounds that seemed too deliberate to be wind. Once I thought I heard heavy footsteps circling our campsite, but when I unzipped my tent to look, everything was silent and still. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, casting weird shadows that made every tree trunk look like a lurking figure. In the morning, we compared notes over coffee and realized we'd both been awake half the night, listening to sounds that shouldn't have been there. That's when we discovered the bear rope had been cut. We were cleaning up after breakfast when my brother-in-law went to check on our food bag. The rope was still strung between the trees, but it had been severed cleanly about 8 feet from the ground. The food bag was gone. He stood there holding the cut end of the rope, examining it closely. The rope had been sliced through with something sharp, a knife or claws used with surgical precision. There were no teeth marks, no frayed edges where an animal might have gnawed through it, just a clean cut. We spent the next hour searching the area around our camp. No sign of the food bag anywhere. No drag marks in the dirt, no torn packaging scattered around, no tracks leading away from the site. Whatever had taken our food had done so without leaving a trace. Bears can't climb that high and cut rope. Coyotes aren't strong enough to carry off a 40-pound bag without dragging it. Something with intelligence and dexterity had visited our camp in the middle of the night, something that could reach 8 feet off the ground and use tools with precision. My brother-in-law suggested we should probably head home. I convinced him to stay one more night. Looking back, that decision probably cost him his life, but at the time, leaving felt like giving up. We'd driven 3 hours to get here, found an amazing fishing spot, and one strange incident wasn't enough to ruin our whole trip. We had enough food in our trucks to last the rest of the trip anyway. Sunday afternoon, we tried fishing again, though our hearts weren't really in it. The silence in the forest continued. No birds, no insects, no small animals rustling in the brush. It was like we were camping in a dead zone where nothing lived except the fish in the lake, and us, and whatever was watching us. While we fished, we'd catch glimpses of something moving through the trees on the opposite shore. Too far away to make out details, but definitely something large, something that seemed to be pacing back and forth parallel to our position. When we'd pointed out to each other and stared directly at the spot, whatever it was would immediately disappear. But 5 minutes later, we'd see movement again, a little farther down the shore, like something was tracking our movements and adjusting its position accordingly. We moved our fishing spot twice that afternoon, hoping to test whether we were really being followed. Both times, within 20 minutes, we'd start seeing movement across the lake again. Whatever was over there was definitely tracking us. This wasn't normal animal behavior. Deer run when they see you. Bears either run or charge. They don't stalk you for hours with obvious intelligence behind their movements. By late afternoon, we'd had enough. We packed up our gear and returned to camp earlier than planned. The sun was still well above the trees, but neither of us wanted to be away from the fire and our trucks when darkness fell. We built the fire bigger than necessary and made sure we had plenty of firewood stacked nearby. Both trucks were parked close to the tents, keys in the ignitions. We weren't taking any chances. Around 8 o'clock that evening, just as full darkness was settling over the forest, we heard heavy footsteps moving through the trees around our campsite. Not the quick, light steps of deer or the shuffling gait of a bear. These were deliberate, measured footsteps, the kind a person makes when they're trying to move quietly but can't quite manage it due to their size. The footsteps would circle our camp slowly, always staying just outside the ring of light cast by our fire. When we'd grab flashlights and shine them toward the sound, the footsteps would immediately stop. Complete silence. But as soon as we'd lower the lights and try to relax, they'd start again from a different direction. This pattern continued for over an hour. Footsteps from the north side of camp, then silence when we investigated. 10 minutes later, footsteps from the east, then the south, then back to the north, like something was methodically studying our campsite, learning the layout, looking for weaknesses. My brother-in-law grabbed his can of bear spray and checked that the safety clip was removed. I found our camp axe and made sure it was within easy reach. We weren't panicking yet, but we were definitely preparing for trouble. The stalking felt calculated, intelligent, like we were being hunted by something that understood tactics and was taking its time to set up the perfect attack. Around 10 o'clock, the footsteps stopped completely. The silence returned, but somehow it felt even more menacing than the stalking had been. We decided to take turns keeping watch through the night, feeding the fire constantly to maintain a large circle of light around our camp. I took the first watch while my brother-in-law tried to get some sleep. Sitting in my camp chair with the axe across my lap, I watched the tree line and listened for any sound. The fire popped and hissed, and occasionally a log would shift and send up a shower of sparks. Other than that, nothing. Around midnight during my watch, I saw the eyes. 2 points of light reflecting the firelight from the forest edge, maybe 50 feet away. They were positioned about 7 feet off the ground, too high for a wolf or coyote, too widely spaced for a deer. They just sat there, unblinking, watching me watch them. I nudged my brother-in-law awake as quietly as possible. When he opened his eyes, I pointed toward the forest edge and whispered. By the time he sat up and looked in that direction, the eyes were gone. We both knew something had been there, something tall enough that its eyes were 7 feet off the ground, something that had been watching me for who knows how long. We spent the rest of the night sitting back to back, feeding the fire every 20 minutes, waiting for dawn. Neither of us slept. Every sound made us tense up, hands reaching for our weapons, but nothing else happened. As the sky began to lighten in the east, whatever had been watching us melted back into the forest. Monday morning, we were both exhausted and on edge. We had planned to spend the day exploring the area around the lake, but instead we found ourselves packing up camp as quickly as possible. My brother-in-law was spooked by something he couldn't identify or explain. The man who taught me to love wilderness camping wanted to leave. I should have listened. As we were loading gear into our trucks, we heard the crashing sounds. It started as a distant rumble, like heavy machinery moving through the forest. But there was no machinery out here. The sound was coming from the forest north of our camp, the same direction we'd seen the mysterious movement the day before. Tree branches snapping, heavy impacts against tree trunks, the unmistakable sound of something large moving fast through dense woods, not caring what it destroyed in its path. And it was getting closer. My brother-in-law told me to get in the truck while he secured the last of our equipment. The crashing sounds were getting louder. Whatever was out there was moving toward us, and it was moving fast. But I could see he wasn't following his own advice. Instead of heading for his vehicle, he was securing the last of our equipment, making sure nothing valuable got left behind. The crashing stopped. In the sudden silence, we could hear our own heartbeats. My brother-in-law straightened up slowly, a stuff sack in each hand, and looked toward the forest. I was standing beside my truck with the driver's door open, ready to jump in and start the engine. That's when it stepped into the clearing. I'll never forget that first clear look at the creature. Nothing could have prepared me for the reality of seeing something that shouldn't exist standing 50 yards away in broad daylight. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall, maybe closer to 8. Its body was muscular and humanoid, but oversized, like a bodybuilder scaled up by 50%. Every inch was covered in dark gray fur, thick and coarse-looking, darker around the shoulders and chest. But it was the head that made my knees go weak. The skull was elongated, more wolf than human, with a pronounced snout filled with large white teeth. Pointed ears sat high on its head, constantly swiveling to track sounds. Its eyes were yellow, bright, and intelligent, and they were studying us with obvious calculation. This wasn't an animal acting on instinct. This was something thinking, planning, deciding what to do with us. The arms were wrong, longer than human proportions, hanging almost to its knees. The hands looked human enough, but with fingers that stretched too long and ended in curved black claws. It stood upright like a person, but there was something unsettling about its posture, too straight, too rigid, like it was forcing itself to stand that way. For maybe 10 seconds, all three of us just stared at each other across the clearing. Nobody moved. I don't think any of us even breathed. Then the creature's lips pulled back in what might have been a grin, revealing a full mouth of fangs. It made a low rumbling sound deep in its chest that built to an ear-splitting howl. The sound went right through me, vibrating in my bones, triggering every flight response in my brain. My brother-in-law dropped the stuffed sacks and slowly reached for the bear spray clipped to his belt. The creature's head tilted slightly, watching his movement with those terrible yellow eyes. It seemed amused by his caution. The grin widened, showing more teeth than should fit in any mouth. The creature made that rumbling sound again, and I realized it was laughing at us. This wasn't a random animal attack or a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. We'd been deliberately hunted by something that had turned killing into an art form. Everything happened in seconds. The creature dropped to all fours and charged across the clearing at a speed that seemed impossible for something so large. It moved like a wolf, powerful legs driving it forward, but it was 3 times the size of any wolf. The ground shook under its weight. My brother-in-law pushed me hard toward my truck and stepped between me and the charging creature. He had the bear spray ready, safety cap off, finger on the trigger. As the creature reached him, he deployed the entire canister in a cloud of chemical irritant that engulfed both of them. The spray didn't even slow it down. The creature hit my brother-in-law like a linebacker tackling a quarterback. The impact drove him backward off his feet, and they went down together in a tangle of arms and claws and fur. The bear spray canister went flying. I reached my truck and had my hand on the door handle, ready to dive in and start the engine. But I couldn't leave. Not while my brother-in-law was fighting for his life 20 feet away. The creature was on top of him, using its claws with surgical precision. Not wild, slashing like an angry animal, but deliberate, controlled cuts designed to disable rather than kill quickly. It was playing with him. My brother-in-law was fighting back desperately, trying to grab the creature's throat or gouge its eyes, but it was like watching a child wrestle an adult. He was completely outmatched. I grabbed the camp axe from the bed of my truck and ran toward the fight. The creature heard me coming and looked up from its work. Blood covered its muzzle and front paws. Its yellow eyes fixed on mine, and once again I saw that terrible intelligence. It wasn't looking at me like a predator looks at prey. It was looking at me like a person looks at an interesting problem. My brother-in-law was still alive, gasping and bleeding but conscious. When he saw me approaching with the axe, he managed to gasp out one word. Then he grabbed the creature's leg with both hands, holding on with the last of his strength to keep it from turning toward me. The creature looked down at him with what seemed like annoyance, then back at me with what I swear was curiosity. I was maybe 10 feet away, close enough to see the individual hairs in its fur, close enough to smell the wild animal musk mixed with the metallic scent of blood. The creature tilted its head to one side, studying me like I was a puzzle it was trying to solve. Then it looked back down at my brother-in-law, who was still clutching its leg, still fighting with everything he had left. That's when I heard something that froze my blood. A second howl, answering from the forest behind me. Then a third from the east side of the clearing. We weren't dealing with one creature. There were at least 3 of them, and they had us surrounded. The creature standing over my brother-in-law raised its head and howled back to its companions. The sound was deafening at close range, but underneath the raw power, I heard something that sounded almost like communication, like it was coordinating with the others. I spun around, trying to track the positions of the other creatures by their calls. The forest edge that had seemed empty moments before now felt alive with hidden watchers. How many were out there? How long had they been watching us? Movement caught my eye to the east. A second creature stepped partway out of the tree line, smaller than the first, but still massive. This one's fur was lighter, more brown than gray, and it moved with a different gait. Where the first creature had seemed methodical and calculating, this one appeared agitated, pacing back and forth at the forest edge like it was eager to join the attack. Behind me, from the direction of our trucks, came the sound of heavy breathing. A third creature, staying hidden but making no effort to mask its presence. They had positioned themselves to cut off every escape route. The first creature, the one standing over my brother-in-law, seemed to be the leader. It looked at each of its companions in turn, then back at me. The yellow eyes held mine for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then it did something that proved these things were far more than animals. It stepped back from my brother-in-law and gestured toward me with one clawed hand, like it was inviting me to try to help him, like it wanted to see what I would do. This was a test. The creature could have killed both of us immediately, but instead it was playing games, studying human behavior, learning how we react under extreme stress. I realized we'd never had a chance. From the moment we'd arrived at this lake, we'd been specimens in some kind of experiment. The cut rope, the stalking, the psychological pressure. It had all been designed to manipulate us into specific reactions. Now they wanted to see how far I'd go to save my brother-in-law. My brother-in-law was still breathing, still conscious, but blood was pooling beneath him. He needed medical attention immediately, or he was going to die. The nearest hospital was 3 hours away by truck, assuming I could even get him there alive. But the creatures weren't going to let me try. The leader took another step back, giving me clear access to my brother-in-law. The invitation was obvious. Come help him, try to save his life. See what happens when you get within range of my claws. I looked at the camp axe in my hands. It felt like a toy compared to the size and strength of what I was facing. Even if I managed to land a solid hit, would it be enough to drive off 3 of these things? Or would it just make them angry? My brother-in-law's eyes found mine. Even through his pain and blood loss, I could see him trying to communicate something. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Then his gaze shifted to my truck and back to me. He was telling me to run. The creature leader's head tilted again, watching this silent exchange with obvious interest. It was learning about human emotional bonds, studying the dynamics between us. How far would I go for family? What would I sacrifice to save someone I cared about? From the forest came soft shuffling sounds. The other creatures were moving closer, tightening the circle. Soon there would be no escape route at all. I made the hardest decision of my life. I dropped the axe and ran for my truck. As I reached my driver's door, I heard my brother-in-law make one final sound. Not a scream of pain or fear, but something that might have been my name. He was saying goodbye. I got the truck started and threw it in reverse, spinning gravel as I backed away from the campsite. Through my windshield, I could see the creature leader standing over my brother-in-law's now motionless form. It wasn't looking down at him anymore, it was staring directly at me. Those yellow eyes followed my truck as I reversed toward the tree line. The creature's head moved with mechanical precision, tracking my movements like a security camera. When I was about 30 feet away, it took a step toward me, then another. That's when the other creatures emerged from the forest. The smaller brown one bounded into the clearing from the east, moving on all fours with frightening speed. Behind me, I heard the third creature crashing through brush as it moved to intercept my escape route. They were coordinating their positions to cut me off. I shifted into drive and floored the accelerator, aiming for a gap between trees that looked just wide enough for my truck. Branches scraped against both sides of the vehicle and spiderwebbed the windshield, but I kept my foot down. I had to get out of there before they surrounded me completely. In my rearview mirror, I caught glimpses of the creatures pursuing me, not running flat out, but loping along at a pace that suggested they could catch me if they really wanted to. They were letting me escape, but staying close enough to herd me in the direction they wanted me to go. The brown creature appeared alongside my truck, keeping pace through the trees maybe 20 feet to my right. It wasn't even breathing hard. Those yellow eyes met mine through the side window, and I saw the same calculating intelligence I'd seen in the leader. This was all part of their plan. They were allowing me to escape so I could serve some purpose. Maybe to spread fear, maybe to bring back more victims, maybe just because one survivor made the hunt more interesting. I drove those dirt roads like a madman for the next hour, bouncing over ruts and rocks that could have shattered an axle or blown a tire. Several times I had to stop and back up when I took a wrong turn at an unmarked intersection. The creatures could have caught me during any of these delays, but they never appeared. They'd made their point. They could have killed me if they wanted to. My survival was a gift, not an accomplishment. It took me almost 2 hours to reach paved road, driving by the lights of my truck through forest that seemed to close in from all sides. Every turn in the road, every shadow between the trees, I expected to see yellow eyes reflecting my headlights. But nothing followed me out of the wilderness. I drove straight to the nearest police station and stumbled through the front door covered in scratches from crashing through brush, clothes torn, hands shaking from adrenaline. I told them my brother-in-law had been attacked by a large animal while we were camping, that we'd been stalked for days by something dangerous, that I needed them to send a rescue team immediately. I couldn't tell them the truth. How do you explain to police officers that a pack of 7-foot-tall wolfmen killed your camping partner? So I stuck to the basics. Animal attack, remote location, injured man needs help. The rescue team included park rangers familiar with the Ottawa National Forest, EMTs, and a helicopter for medical evacuation if needed. I led them back to our campsite, following the same route we'd taken that morning. When we reached the clearing, we found blood. Lots of it, a dark stain in the dirt where the attack had happened, drag marks leading toward the forest, torn pieces of clothing scattered around the campsite, but no body. The rangers searched the surrounding area for hours. They brought in tracking dogs and expanded the search grid to cover several square miles. They found more blood, more torn clothing, signs of a struggle that had continued into the forest. But they never found my brother-in-law. During the search, one of the rangers made a discovery that he kept quiet until after the official report was filed. Deep in the forest, about half a mile from our campsite, he'd found what looked like a primitive shelter built from fallen logs and branches. He described it as a lean-to structure, but much larger than anything a human would build. The entrance was big enough for something 7 or 8 feet tall to walk through upright. Inside, the ground was packed down like it had been used regularly over a long period of time. Most disturbing, scattered around the shelter, were bone fragments. The The ranger couldn't identify what kind of bones they were, but some looked suspiciously like human remains. Others appeared to be from deer, bear, and smaller animals. Near the shelter entrance, partially buried under a pile of leaves, he found a child's tennis shoe. Small, maybe size 3, weathered but not old enough to have been there for years. The shoe had been chewed on. Puncture marks from large teeth were clearly visible in the rubber sole. The ranger bagged the shoe and the bone fragments as evidence, but they never made it into the official report. When I asked about them weeks later, he claimed they'd been lost during processing. I suspect someone higher up decided the evidence raised too many questions that couldn't be answered with conventional explanations. But the ranger's description of that shelter has haunted me ever since. It suggested these creatures weren't just passing through the area, they lived there. They'd established permanent residence in territory they defended against human intrusion. The bone fragments and children's shoe implied a history of victims that went back much further than our encounter. How many campers, hikers, and hunters had disappeared in that area over the years? How many families have been told their loved ones were victims of equipment failure or getting lost when the truth was much darker? 3 years have passed since that terrible weekend at the lake. 3 years of carrying knowledge that could save lives but would be dismissed as fantasy if shared openly. 3 years of watching news reports about missing hikers and unexplained disappearances while knowing what probably really happened to them. The guilt has lessened somewhat, but it will never completely disappear. I survived because my brother-in-law sacrificed himself to buy me time to escape. That's a debt I can never repay and a responsibility I can never fully bear. The creatures are real, they're intelligent, they're organized, and they're still out there in clearings beside pristine mountain lakes, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting campers to wander into their territory. My brother-in-law learned that lesson too late. Learn from his experience while you still can. Some secrets are too terrible to share, but too important to keep buried. When I inherited my father's farm last winter, I never expected to uncover evidence that would change everything I thought I knew about the world, or about my own family's history. Hidden in the dusty corners of our old barn, wrapped in oiled canvas and forgotten for decades, I discovered a collection of grainy black and white photographs that would make any cryptozoologist's heart race. What you're about to hear is the untold story of my father's encounters with a creature that shouldn't exist, documented over nearly a decade through primitive security cameras he installed around our remote Oregon property in the early 1960s. My father was a practical man who never spoke of monsters or mysteries. He farmed 400 acres of timber and pasture land in the Cascade foothills, raised cattle, and fixed whatever broke with his own 2 hands. He wasn't given to flights of fancy or tall tales. So when I found these images, 6 of them showing a massive bipedal figure stalking through our property under cover of darkness, I knew they had to be real. My father had captured something extraordinary, something that had visited our farm during the spring months of those early years, when he and my mother were young newlyweds trying to build a life on land that clearly belonged to something else first. Our property sits in a valley 25 miles east of Salem, Oregon, where the Willamette Valley meets the western slopes of the Cascade Mountains. The land stretches from rolling pastures up into dense Douglas fir and cedar forest that extends unbroken for miles into the national forest beyond. It's the kind of place where civilization gradually fades into wilderness, where logging roads disappear into green shadows and the sound of chainsaws gives way to the calls of creatures most people never hear. My father chose this land in 1960, drawn by its isolation and the promise of timber revenue to supplement the income from cattle ranching. The property came with a modest farmhouse, a large barn, and several outbuildings arranged around a central yard. What made it unique was its position at the junction of 3 different ecosystems: managed timberland to the north, old-growth forest to the east, and open pasture to the south and west. It was from the old-growth forest that our visitor would emerge, year after year, during those early spring months when the snow had melted and new growth was beginning to show. According to my father's stories, the encounters began in 1962, just after I was born, and continued with remarkable consistency through the early 1970s. My father never kept written records of his experiences, but throughout my childhood he would occasionally share stories that I dismissed as tall tales meant to entertain a young boy. It wasn't until I found the photographs that I realized every word had been true. The first sign something unusual lived in our forest came during the spring of 1962. My father had been working late, repairing fence line that had been damaged during the winter storms. As he tells it, he was hammering posts near the edge of the timber when he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. A deep, guttural call that seemed to come from something much larger than any known animal. At first he assumed it was a bear. Black bears were common in our area, and the spring months brought them out of hibernation, hungry and sometimes aggressive. But when he looked toward the sound, what he saw defied explanation. Standing at the edge of the tree line, perhaps 60 yards away, was a figure that walked upright like a man but stood nearly 8 feet tall and was covered in dark hair from head to foot. The creature seemed as surprised to see him as he was to see it. For several long moments they stared at each other across the fading light of dusk. Then, without warning, the thing simply melted back into the forest, moving with a fluid grace that no bear could match. My father said the intelligence in its eyes was unmistakable. This was no ordinary animal. That first encounter haunted my father for weeks. He began paying closer attention to signs around the property: broken branches at unusual heights, footprints too large and too human-like to belong to any known creature. And most disturbing of all, evidence that something had been watching the house from the forest edge. By the spring of 1963, my father had made a decision that would prove crucial to documenting these encounters. Using money saved from timber sales and every spare penny from the ranch's modest profits, he invested in what was then cutting-edge security technology, a system of motion-activated cameras that could operate in low-light conditions. The equipment was primitive by today's standards, bulky cameras housed in weatherproof cases, triggered by mechanical motion detectors that had been designed for military applications. My father installed 6 cameras around the property's perimeter, focusing on the areas where he had observed the most unusual activity. Each camera could capture a single photograph when triggered, and the infrared flash system allowed for nighttime documentation. My father told me he spent nearly 3 months' income on that camera system, a decision my mother questioned at the time. She thought he was overreacting to what had probably been a bear sighting, but my father knew what he'd seen. More importantly, he had a family to protect and livestock to consider. If something that large and intelligent was regularly visiting the property, he wanted to know about it. The cameras proved their worth within weeks of installation. Throughout the spring of 1963 and in subsequent years, my father's system captured 6 clear images of what can only be described as a Sasquatch visiting our property with remarkable regularity. The photographs reveal a pattern that would have been impossible to detect through casual observation. The creature appeared to visit during the same general time period each year. Late spring, typically April or May, when the weather had warmed but before the height of summer. The visits seemed to coincide with what my father described as the green-up, when new plant growth was most abundant and various wild foods would be emerging from the forest floor. What struck my father most about these visits was the creature's apparent intelligence and curiosity. Rather than avoiding the farm buildings, it seemed drawn to them, investigating structures and equipment with what appeared to be genuine interest. My father would often find evidence of these nocturnal inspections: gates that had been carefully opened and closed, equipment that had been moved but not damaged, and most memorably, feed containers that had been opened, examined, and properly resealed. My father described the creature as methodical in its explorations. It would spend considerable time at each location, seemingly studying the human activity, and perhaps trying to understand the purpose of various structures and tools. Unlike a wild animal driven by hunger or territorial instincts, this visitor appeared to be motivated by curiosity, the same drive that sends human explorers into unknown territories. One of the most remarkable aspects of my father's accounts was how he described the creature's behavior evolving over the years. During the early encounters, it had been cautious, staying at the edges of clearings and retreating quickly if detected. But as time passed, it became bolder, approaching closer to the buildings and spending longer periods investigating the farm's operations. My father told me about finding massive footprints in the soft earth around the water trough, suggesting the creature had been drinking there regularly. The prints were unlike anything he'd ever seen, nearly 18 inches long, with clear toe definition that ruled out any known animal. The depth of the impression suggested enormous weight, but the spacing and arrangement indicated bipedal locomotion. Perhaps most intriguingly, my father noticed that the creature seemed to learn from its observations. During later visits, it demonstrated understanding of how various mechanisms worked, operating latches and gates with increasing sophistication. My father once found that someone or something had figured out how to work the pump handle at the well, leaving clear evidence of water having been drawn from a depth that would require understanding of cause and effect. The creature also showed what appeared to be respect for property. Despite its obvious strength, my father estimated it could easily tear apart any of our structures. It caused minimal damage during its visits. Gates were left as they were found, tools were returned to their approximate original positions, and even when food sources were investigated, containers were carefully resealed rather than destroyed. Over the years, my father began to think of these visits as a kind of spring ritual. The creature would appear sometime in late April or early May, conduct its careful inspection of the property, and then disappear until the following year. The consistency was remarkable. My father could almost predict within a week when the cameras would be triggered. During one memorable spring in the mid-1960s, my father decided to test the creature's intelligence. He deliberately left a toolbox open near the barn with various implements arranged in a specific pattern. The next morning, he found that the tools had been carefully examined and replaced, but in a slightly different arrangement that suggested deliberate reorganization rather than random disturbance. This led my father to conduct other informal experiments. He would leave different objects in areas where the creature was known to visit: pieces of equipment, food items, even simple puzzles made from farm implements. Invariably, these items showed evidence of careful investigation and sometimes creative problem-solving that impressed my father more than it frightened him. My father began to view these annual visits less as encounters with a dangerous wild animal and more as interactions with an intelligence that was simply different from human intelligence. The creature seemed to be conducting its own study of human behavior, learning about farming practices and technology with the same curiosity that drove my father to document its visits. One of the stories my father told most often involved what he called the learning curve. During the early years, the creature had approached various farm equipment with obvious caution, touching items briefly before retreating. But as the visits continued, its investigations became more thorough and sophisticated. My father described finding evidence that the creature had figured out how to operate the manual water pump, had learned to open and close various types of latches, and had even demonstrated understanding of basic mechanical principles. During one visit, it apparently spent considerable time examining a broken piece of equipment, arranging the parts in a way that suggested it understood how they should fit together. The creature also seemed to develop preferences and routines. Certain areas of the property received more attention than others, and the sequence of its visits became predictable. It would typically begin at the well house, proceed to the barn area, investigate the equipment shed, and finish at the main house before retreating to the forest. My father noticed that the creature paid particular attention to anything new or changed since its previous visit. New equipment would receive thorough examination, modifications to buildings would be carefully studied, and even changes in landscaping seemed to interest the visitor. This suggested not only intelligence but also excellent memory, as the creature was clearly comparing current conditions to its recollections from previous years. What separated my father's accounts from typical wildlife encounters was his growing conviction that he was dealing with genuine intelligence rather than animal instinct. Over the years, he began to notice patterns of behavior that suggested not just learning, but actual problem solving and possibly even planning. One story he told repeatedly involved what he called the Great Feed Mystery. During the spring of 1965, my father had been storing cattle feed in metal bins that required lifting heavy lids and manipulating a simple latch mechanism. After several mornings of finding the bins opened and a small amount of feed missing, he initially suspected raccoons or bears, but the quantity taken was always modest, never the destructive feeding frenzy typical of hungry wildlife. Curious, my father began experimenting with increasingly complex latching mechanisms. First, he added a simple hook and eye closure. The next morning, it had been carefully unhooked and rehooked after feeding. Then he tried a sliding bolt mechanism. Again, it was properly operated and returned to its closed position. Finally, he installed a system that required simultaneous manipulation of 2 separate latches. This took 3 nights to solve, but eventually the creature figured it out. What impressed my father most was not just that the problems were solved, but how they were solved. There was never evidence of frustrated attempts or destructive trial and error. The creature seemed to study each mechanism carefully, understand its function, and then operate it correctly on the first attempt. This suggested reasoning ability that went far beyond simple conditioning or instinctive behavior. My father also noticed that the creature appeared to understand cause and effect in complex situations. During one memorable spring, we had a problem with our automatic watering system, a simple mechanism that used a float valve to maintain water levels in the cattle troughs. The system had been malfunctioning, causing the trough to overflow and create muddy conditions that bothered both the cattle and my father. After several frustrating attempts to repair the mechanism, my father gave up temporarily and reverted to filling the trough manually each evening. The next morning, he found that someone had fixed the float valve system. Not only was it working properly, but it had been adjusted with a precision that exceeded my father's own mechanical skills. The repair required understanding hydraulic principles, the relationship between water pressure and valve operation, and the fine motor control to make delicate adjustments. My father never mentioned this incident to anyone during his lifetime, knowing how impossible it would sound. But he told me years later that it was this event more than any other that convinced him he was dealing with an intelligence that might rival or exceed human problem-solving ability in certain areas. Over the years, my father began to recognize a precise pattern to the visits that suggested the creature operated according to some kind of internal calendar or environmental awareness system. The timing was remarkably consistent. always late spring, typically beginning in the 3rd or 4th week of April and continuing for about 6 weeks until early June. The visits seemed to coincide with specific natural phenomena that my father learned to recognize. They would begin shortly after the first significant wildflower blooms, but before the peak growing season. This timing suggested the creature might be following seasonal food sources, possibly the emergence of particular plants, fungi, or the increased activity of various prey species. My father noticed that weather patterns immediately before the visits were often similar. Several days of warm, dry conditions following spring rains. This created optimal conditions for travel through the forest, with soft ground that would muffle footsteps but dry enough to avoid leaving obvious tracks. The creature seemed to understand these optimal conditions and time its visits accordingly. The duration of each annual visitation period also followed a pattern. Early visits were brief, perhaps a single night of investigation. But as the weeks progressed, the creature would spend more time on the property, sometimes returning several nights in a row. Toward the end of each season, the visits would taper off gradually, as if the creature was completing some kind of systematic study before departing for another year. My father theorized that these spring visits might represent some kind of territorial maintenance behavior, similar to how some animals mark and patrol their ranges. But the creature's behavior was more complex than simple territorial marking. It seemed to be conducting detailed assessments of changes to the property, learning about new developments, and possibly gathering information about human activities and agricultural practices. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of my father's long-term observations was how the creature's behavior evolved over the years, suggesting not just intelligence, but the ability to learn from experience and modify behavior accordingly. During the early encounters in the 1960s, the creature had been cautious and somewhat clumsy in its interactions with human-made objects. But as the years passed, its approach became increasingly sophisticated. My father described watching this learning process with fascination. During early visits, the creature would approach unfamiliar objects with obvious caution, touching them briefly before retreating to a safe distance. But once it had determined that an object was harmless, it would remember this for subsequent visits. Items that had required careful investigation during one spring would be handled confidently the following year. The creature also demonstrated the ability to generalize from specific experiences to new situations. After learning how one type of latch mechanism worked, it could quickly figure out similar but not identical mechanisms. This suggested abstract thinking, the ability to understand principles rather than just memorizing specific solutions. More remarkably, the creature seemed to develop preferences and aesthetic judgments. My father noticed that certain areas of the property received more attention than others, not based on practical considerations like food availability or security, but apparently because the creature found them interesting or appealing. The well house, with its combination of mechanical complexity and water source, was always a favorite destination. But the creature also spent considerable time examining what we called the flower garden, a small area where my mother had planted decorative flowers and vegetables. My father began to suspect that the creature was not just studying human technology, but human culture. It showed particular interest in anything that seemed to serve aesthetic rather than purely practical purposes. Garden decorations, painted surfaces, and even laundry hanging on clotheslines received careful examination. This suggested an appreciation for human creativity and possibly an understanding that some human activities extended beyond mere survival needs. One of the most intriguing aspects of my father's accounts involved what he believed were attempts at communication from the creature. While he never claimed to have engaged in direct conversation, he described several incidents that suggested the creature was trying to establish some form of contact or understanding. The first of these occurred during the spring of 1966, when my father began leaving small gifts in areas where the creature was known to visit. Initially, these were practical items: tools, food, simple mechanical objects. The creature would examine these offerings carefully but never took anything. However, it began leaving its own items in return: unusually shaped stones, interesting pieces of wood, and occasionally small arrangements of natural materials that seemed too deliberate to be coincidental. My father interpreted this as a form of reciprocal communication, an acknowledgement of his peaceful intentions, and perhaps an attempt to establish friendly relations. He began varying his offerings to see how the creature would respond. Simple tools were examined but ignored. Food items were investigated but left untouched. But anything that demonstrated human craftsmanship or creativity, carved wood, woven materials, painted objects, received prolonged attention and was sometimes repositioned in ways that suggested appreciation. The creature's return gifts became increasingly elaborate over the years. What had started as simple stone arrangements evolved into complex constructions that served no obvious practical purpose, but demonstrated aesthetic sensibility and considerable skill. My father found delicate sculptures made from twigs and leaves, stone cairns balanced with engineering precision that he couldn't duplicate, and patterns created from natural materials that were too complex to be accidental. Most remarkably, the creature seemed to respond to changes in my father's emotional state or family circumstances. During periods of stress, crop failures, equipment breakdowns, or family health problems, the creature's offerings became more frequent and elaborate, as if it were trying to provide comfort or encouragement. When I was born in 1962, my father found an intricate arrangement of flowers and soft grasses near the house that seemed deliberately placed as a welcoming gift for the new family member. As the years passed, my father began to notice that the creature seemed to take a protective interest in our family and property. While it never interfered directly with farm operations, there were several incidents that suggested it was monitoring our welfare and possibly intervening in subtle ways when problems arose. During the harsh winter of 1967 to 68, we experienced a series of equipment failures that threatened our ability to care for the livestock. Our main water pump failed during a cold snap. Several fence sections collapsed under snow loads, and a tree fell across our access road, cutting us off from town for several days. My father spent exhausting days trying to make repairs in dangerous conditions. When spring arrived and the creature resumed its visits, my father found that many of these problems had been quietly addressed. The fallen tree had been sectioned and moved off the road with a precision that his chainsaw couldn't match. The cuts were clean and straight as if made with industrial equipment, but there were no machine tracks or other evidence of human activity. Several fence posts had been reset with a skill that exceeded my father's own carpentry abilities. Most mysteriously, my father discovered that someone had repaired the water pump using techniques he didn't recognize. The mechanism had been rebuilt with what appeared to be handmade parts crafted from materials that weren't available at any local supply store. The repair was not only functional but superior to the original design, incorporating improvements that prevented the type of failure that had originally occurred. My father never mentioned these incidents to anyone, knowing how incredible they would sound. But he told me years later that this was when he stopped thinking of the creature as simply an intelligent animal and began to consider the possibility that he was dealing with something approaching a different type of person, someone with capabilities and knowledge that complemented rather than competed with human skills. Perhaps the most personal aspect of my father's accounts involved the creature's apparent interest in our family life. Unlike typical wildlife, which tends to avoid human activity, this visitor seemed drawn to observe domestic routines and family interactions. My father often found evidence that the creature had been watching the house from concealed positions that provided clear views of windows and outdoor activities. This surveillance never felt threatening to my father. Rather, he described it as curious and somehow benevolent, as if the creature were trying to understand human family dynamics and social behavior. During family gatherings, holiday celebrations, or other special events, my father would sometimes spot movement at the forest edge that suggested the creature was observing our activities with particular interest. The creature seemed especially fascinated by childhood activities. As I grew from infant to toddler, my father noticed increased activity around areas where I played. Toys left outside would be carefully examined and returned to their exact positions. My sandbox received frequent nocturnal visits, with my father often finding large handprints in the sand alongside my small ones, as if the creature were trying to understand the concept of play. Most remarkably, the creature appeared to understand and respect human concepts of property and privacy. Despite its obvious strength and ability to access any area of our property, it never entered our house or damaged personal belongings. It seemed to recognize boundaries between public and private spaces, limiting its investigations to areas that might be considered communal: barns, equipment sheds, and outdoor work areas. My father believed the creature was conducting a long-term study of human behavior, possibly trying to understand how our species organized itself socially and economically. The farm provided an ideal laboratory for such observations, offering examples of human-animal relationships, agricultural practices, family structures, and technological applications all in one location. The images I found represent the clearest documentation from my father's years of observation. Each was captured during the spring months between 1963 and 1969, and together they provide an unprecedented glimpse into the behavior of what may be North America's most elusive inhabitant. One shows the creature approaching our main barn during what appears to be a clear spring night. The massive frame and confident strides suggest complete familiarity with the area. What strikes me most about this photograph is the creature's posture: alert but not defensive, curious rather than aggressive. The way it moves suggests years of experience navigating our property. Another one is in open ground near what we called the equipment yard, where tractors and implements were stored. The boldness required to venture into such an exposed area speaks to either great confidence or compelling curiosity. The creature's body language suggests focused attention on something specific, possibly observing lights or sounds from within the house. My father always suspected the creature was trying to understand human domestic life. The careful posture and focused attention suggest genuine interest in understanding human technology and its applications. Another image documents what appears to be the creature's final approach to our immediate living area. The proximity to the house and outbuilding shows remarkable boldness for what is supposedly a wild creature. The relaxed posture suggests this visitor had become completely comfortable with our property over the years of regular visits. Technical analysis. Since discovering these photographs, I've had them examined by several experts in photographic analysis and wildlife behavior. While none would provide official conclusions due to the controversial nature of the subject, their informal assessments have been remarkably consistent. The image quality, while limited by 1960s camera technology, shows anatomical details that are difficult to explain as misidentification or fakery. The creature's proportions are unlike any known primate. The elongated limbs, massive shoulder development, and distinctive posture suggest adaptations for both forest locomotion and bipedal travel across varied terrain. Digital enhancement has revealed details invisible in the original prints: muscle definition that suggests enormous strength, a gait pattern distinctly different from both human and ape locomotion, and facial features that, while partially obscured by shadows and image quality, appear to show high intelligence. Perhaps most convincingly, the consistency across multiple images taken over several years argues strongly for authenticity. The lighting, shadows, and environmental details all correspond to the known conditions at our property during the 1960s, and the progressive improvement in image quality reflects my father's growing expertise with the camera system. As the 1960s drew to a close, the frequency of visits began to diminish. My father's final clear photograph was captured in the spring of 1969, showing what appeared to be a farewell visit from our long-term guest. After that, the cameras recorded only ordinary wildlife: deer, elk, the occasional bear or cougar. Several factors may have contributed to this change. Increased logging activity in the surrounding national forest disrupted traditional wildlife corridors and eliminated much of the old-growth habitat that likely supported the creature's population. Development pressure was also increasing throughout the Cascade foothills as Portland's population grew, and more people sought rural properties. My father always believed the creature simply moved deeper into the wilderness, finding new territories away from increasing human activity. The completion of several major logging roads during this period opened previously inaccessible areas that might have provided the isolation such a creature would require. There were also natural factors to consider. Climate patterns were changing during this period, affecting local vegetation and wildlife populations. The specific combination of environmental conditions that had made our valley attractive to the visitor may have simply evolved beyond its preferences or needs. Throughout my childhood and into my adult years, my father kept his secret well. In our rural community, where practical concerns dominated daily conversation, tales of mysterious forest creatures would have been met with skepticism at best. He was already viewed as somewhat eccentric for his investment in sophisticated security equipment, and he had no desire to further damage his reputation with stories that would sound like frontier folklore. Instead, my father channeled his fascination into becoming something of an amateur naturalist. He developed an encyclopedic knowledge of local wildlife, could predict weather patterns with remarkable accuracy, and became known throughout our area as the person to consult about unusual animal behavior or forest conditions. The camera system remained in place until the late 1970s, when the aging equipment finally became too expensive to maintain. By then, my father had largely given up hope of additional encounters. The forest had changed, development had increased, and the world had become a smaller place with less room for creatures that required vast territories and absolute privacy. My father passed away in 2018, taking his stories with him. It was only while cleaning out the barn afterward that I discovered the photographs he'd kept hidden for over half a century. Along with the images, I found technical notes about camera placement, exposure settings, and timing data that confirm the authenticity of his documentation. The discovery of my father's photographs has forced me to reconsider everything I thought I knew about the natural world. If creatures like this existed, and the evidence suggests they did, then our understanding of North American wildlife and ecology is fundamentally incomplete. Recent advances in DNA analysis and wildlife tracking technology offer new possibilities for detecting and studying such creatures, assuming any still exist. Trail cameras with motion sensors far more sophisticated than my father's 1960s equipment are now affordable and widely used by hunters and researchers. Genetic sampling techniques can extract usable DNA from hair, saliva, and even footprints in certain conditions. Yet despite these technological advances, credible Sasquatch documentation has become increasingly rare. This suggests either that populations have declined dramatically, or that surviving individuals have learned to avoid detection by increasingly sophisticated human monitoring systems. Climate change has also dramatically altered the forest ecosystems where such creatures would live. The old-growth forests that once covered much of the Pacific Northwest have been reduced to small, isolated patches. Traditional food sources have changed, seasonal patterns have shifted, and habitat corridors have been fragmented by development and resource extraction. For months after discovering my father's collection, I wrestled with whether to make this information public. The scientific value could be enormous. The first systematic documentation of Sasquatch behavior would revolutionize our understanding of primate evolution and North American ecology. But there are compelling arguments for continued secrecy as well. My father chose silence for good reasons. Publicity would inevitably bring attention to our valley that such creatures clearly prefer to avoid. Researchers, trophy hunters, tourists, and media attention would transform our quiet corner of Oregon into a circus, potentially driving away not just any remaining Sasquatch, but all the wildlife that makes this area special. Legal protection might seem like an obvious solution, but official recognition as an endangered species would require extensive documentation and study that could be more disruptive than protective. The bureaucratic process would likely involve years of investigation, habitat surveys, and environmental impact studies that would destroy the very privacy these creatures seem to require. There's also the question of human safety. While my father's visitor appeared benign, even curious about human activity, we have no way of knowing whether this represents typical behavior for the species. Increased human-Sasquatch contact could lead to dangerous encounters, either from creatures defending territory or from humans seeking to capture or harm them. Despite my father's belief that the creature had moved on permanently, evidence suggests that Sasquatch may still occasionally visit our valley. Last spring, I discovered tracks near our creek that closely matched the measurements and characteristics of prints my father had documented decades earlier. The tracks appeared after several days of heavy rain in soft mud that preserved remarkable detail. Modern trail cameras I've installed have captured distant figures that could be bears walking upright, but the proportions and movement patterns are more consistent with the creature in my father's photographs. The images are frustratingly inconclusive, distant shadows that could be anything, but which appear at locations and times that match my father's historical observations. Neighboring landowners have reported incidents that echo my father's experiences. Missing livestock feed, equipment that's been moved but not damaged, and occasional sightings of large bipedal figures at the forest edge. None connect these incidents to Sasquatch. Rational explanations involving bears, trespassers, or equipment malfunction are easier to accept than the possibility that we share our forests with unknown creatures. I've begun my own documentation project using digital cameras and motion sensors to monitor areas where my father recorded the most activity. The equipment is far superior to what he used, but the results have been disappointing. A few ambiguous images, some questionable tracks, sounds that could be interpreted various ways, nothing approaching the clear documentation my father achieved. Perhaps the creatures have learned to avoid cameras entirely, having observed human technology evolve over the decades. Perhaps they've moved to more remote territories where human contact is impossible. Or perhaps they're still here, watching and waiting with the same patience they showed during my father's time. Inheriting my father's secret has changed how I see our valley and my place in it. Every shadow at the forest edge could be significant. Every unexplained sound might be communication from intelligences we don't understand. The familiar landscape of my childhood has become charged with possibility and mystery. I've continued farming much as my father did, raising cattle and managing our timber stands according to sustainable practices that maintain habitat for all the creatures that call this valley home. whether our occasional visitor still exists or has moved on to territories beyond human reach, this land bears the memory of remarkable encounters between species separated by millions of years of evolution. The photographs my father left behind represent more than evidence of an unknown creature. They document a time when the world still held secrets, when intelligence took forms we didn't recognize, and when the wilderness preserved mysteries that challenge our understanding of what was possible. My father spent his final years wondering whether he had witnessed something unique in natural history, regular encounters with one of North America's most elusive inhabitants during a brief period when human expansion and wild habitat intersected in just the right way. His photographs preserve a record of these meetings without compromising the creature's privacy or safety. The evidence speaks for itself. 6 clear images of a bipedal creature displaying intelligence, curiosity, and behavioral patterns unlike any known animal. Technical analysis supports their authenticity, and the behavioral documentation reveals characteristics that would be impossible to fake convincingly across multiple years and locations. Yet questions remain. Who was this visitor that returned year after year to study our farm and our family? Where did it come from? And where did it go when development pressure made our valley less suitable for such encounters? Are others still out there, adapting to a world that offers fewer and fewer places where they can exist undetected? Perhaps most importantly, what responsibility do we bear toward creatures that clearly possess intelligence and complex behavioral patterns? If they still exist, they deserve our respect and protection, not our attempts to capture, study, or exploit them for scientific or commercial gain. My father's greatest contribution may have been his discretion. For over 50 years, he kept these encounters secret, allowing a remarkable creature to visit our property without the intrusion of researchers, media attention, or curiosity seekers. His photographs preserve proof of existence while respecting the creature's obvious desire for privacy. As I continue to tend the land my father loved, I sometimes stand where he once stood when he first encountered something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the natural world. The forest looks unchanged, the mountains stand eternal, and on quiet spring evenings when conditions are just right, I find myself watching the tree line with the same sense of expectation my father must have felt. Whether our visitor still walks these woods or has moved on to territories beyond human reach, it has left an indelible mark on this valley and on everyone privileged to witness its existence. My father's documentation stands as testament to a time when the world was large enough to hold mysteries, when intelligence could take forms we never expected, and when the wilderness still kept its greatest secrets. The photographs speak the truth my father could never tell. The creature existed, walked among us for a brief moment in history, and then returned to the shadows from which it came. What remains is proof that we share this world with intelligences older and perhaps wiser than our own, and that some mysteries are worth preserving, even at the cost of never fully understanding them. For more stories like this, check out this one.